Are you ready?
Oh yeah!
From parts unknown and into your home, this is the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. Now, here's your host, Groovy G.
Hello there folks and welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. On this episode, if you've ever seen a belt review on YouTube, it was probably done by this man. I'm talking of course about HazardF5. He joins us right now.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovyGshop.com.
HazardF5, welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. How are you?
I'm Mr. Barrett, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. You doing okay?
Oh mate, every day's a good day for Groovy G. Hey, let's start off. When did you first get into belt collecting? What was that moment where you actually saw a title belt on TV and thought, man, I've got to get me one of those?
Well, it would have been obviously when I was a lot younger. I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, just channel surfing with my brother, and we came across WCW. I was always a WCW kid, and I saw the big gold belt, and I think Sting had it at the time, and I thought, I've got to get me one of those. And pretty much since then on, because back in the day, they didn't have replica belts or anything like that, so a few years down the line, I started getting into collecting. My parents got me my first replica belt, and they said, we'll get you one, that's it, we're not giving you any more money for this kind of tosh. And from that point on, I've been saving up and getting them myself. So yeah, getting eyes on the big gold belt, and I was thought to myself, I've got to have that one day. So I was around sort of like between 5 and 7 at the time.
And what was the first ever belt that you ever owned? Do you remember that one?
It's been so long. It was in the early 2000s, so it would have either been, I think it would have either been the Undisputed version 1 replica or the Raw WWE Big Gold. I think it might have been the Undisputed.
What's in your current collection?
Oh, I wouldn't be able to tell you. There's upwards of around 20 belts. I've got, I'm trying to think. So I've got Big Gold, I've got the current Cruiserweight, I've got the Restone Reloaded Spinner, the WWE Championship, I've got a Big Eagle in there, I've got a United States Championship by Leather by Dan, I've got, what are the ones? The TNA World Title, the Wildcat and the Midwest version. I've got the Oval IC, which arrived a couple of months back. I wouldn't be able to name all of them because I'm not currently looking at them right now, but there's around the 20 mark-ish.
And how do you display your collection?
A lot of collectors I've seen use my own method. The IKEA glass display cabinets where they have sort of like 4 open slots, sort of cubic-based slots. I use those myself. I've got 4 of them at the moment. I've literally just yesterday purchased 2 more because I don't have the room because I've currently moved house, so I've bought 2 more for myself, and they're going to be filled up hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Now, most people will know you from your YouTube videos. How did they come about?
Purely by sheer accident. I was watching YouTube and I just stumbled across a video. I forget what video or who it was, and it was a review on a belt that I was relatively familiar with, and I've been watching wrestling since I was about 5, and I've been a belt enthusiast since then. Sort of, I've always noticed little things that changed, like the paint scheme or a texturing. I'd always spot them on TV, and I thought to myself, the person who's doing this review, there's so much stuff that they're missing in sort of the details on it. So I thought I'd sort of give it a go myself and highlight some of the areas that maybe were missed. And I always figured that whenever people were getting into replica belt collecting, because back then there wasn't really an availability like to get a real belt like there is now. Everyone makes real belts nowadays. There was only the replicas, and it was few and far between you seeing a detailed look at what you'd be buying when you got a replica. So I thought, well, there's not many videos out there, so I'll do replica belt reviews so people can see what belts they'd like to get and what belts maybe wasn't worth their time or what wasn't worth their money. So at the time, I figured, well, there's an open market or an open slot in the fandom, so I'll go ahead and I'll throw my 2 cents in there. It seems to have caught on quite well over the last, God, how long has it been? I think my first video was in 2006. So what's that, 10, 11, 12, 13 years?
Absolutely, and most people will know you from those YouTube shows. When you go out to wrestling shows or just out in the general public, do people recognise you from your YouTube videos?
It's very weird, but yes. I've been recognised twice just in general, sort of. I would just be out shopping, walking up High Street, and someone would sort of be looking at me really oddly and say, "Excuse me, do you have a YouTube channel?" Or, "Excuse me, do you collect wrestling belts?" And they can know me from there. I get spotted semi-regularly at wrestling shows, particularly if I've got a belt of note with me. So if I've got the Crumline belt, which is obviously very different to the WWE shop belts, or if I've got my custom SmackDown AJ Styles belt, which is now redundant now that he's on Raw, with me, and it's something very noteworthy that's very different, they'll spot me immediately. So I get spotted quite a lot at wrestling shows, and I sort of generally have a chat with them, and either they'll come over to me and say, "Oh, I watch your videos," or "Are you Hazard?" Sometimes I'll have a little bit of fun with them, and I'll pretend I don't know what they're talking about. But yeah, mostly at wrestling shows.
Why are your videos always shot in the bathroom?
I probably get that one question more than any other question in regards to wrestling belts. And literally the answer is lighting. The house I've been in since, I started my YouTube channel, has always been very poorly lit. It just has sort of like spotlights here and there. So that room, because you've got the window in the background and you've got an overarching light above the mirror, it's always been the best way to provide lighting. Outside of that, obviously going outside to natural light in the garden and stuff's always great, but being in England, you're looking at either a cloudy sky or rain 99% of the time, so it's very rarely that you get a sunny day here, which is why whenever I'm doing a belt review and it is sunny, I'll always try and get outside. But literally, the answer is lighting.
Now, did you get any flack from making those videos, particularly from people in the belt collecting community, but also just, I guess, friends, relatives, that type of stuff?
Well, yes and no. When I joined BeltTalk.com many, many years ago, for about a year, I was known as the YouTube belt guy because I think the whole YouTube reviewing thing was sort of frowned upon then, because it is a very close-knit community, and like wrestling belts themselves, you'll have very casual collectors who get the WWE shop replicas who assume they're identical to the ones that you see on TV every week, which is fine. But then you get the other spectrum where you've got real belt collectors and they're very protective of that. And I think they thought, sort of, what's this guy talking about, kind of thing. And after a while, I think most people started realizing that, while by no stretch of the imagination do I think I know everything, because I really, really don't. But I know enough to sort of provide that kind of service or channel where I know enough about the changes over time with the design and stuff and reviews and stuff, that I can put something out there and it'd be relatively accurate. Obviously, there's going to be stuff that I miss and stuff that I forget about and stuff that I just generally don't know about, which is why I haven't gone anywhere near the New Japan belts or done reviews on those, because I just don't know enough about them to do them justice. But after a while, I think people started realizing he kind of knows what he's talking about. He got in tight with a few of those. As far as like family and stuff go, yeah, I often get asked, why do you buy those things? They just sit there and you just look at them every once in a while. Like, what's good at that? And I'll be like, well, yeah, but then you've got a displayed football T-shirt from your local club, and all you do is just stare at that. Or all you've got is a picture here of like a famous painting, and all you do is stare at that sort of thing. So to each his own. I mean, if you earn your money, obviously some people collect one thing, some people collect another. I'm just generally an all-round geeky person, so I've been mocked for that many, many times over the years. Yeah, I'm into wrestling. Yeah, it's predetermined. Yeah, I'm into wrestling belt collecting. Yeah, I've got too many of them. Yeah, I'm into Power Rangers. Yes, it's a geeky thing, but at the end of the day, geeks have been ruling the world since 2002. You can't go to the cinema for less than in a month span and not see the number one box office movie being a superhero movie. So at the end of the day, I'm sort of in trend at the moment, I guess.
And that was the other thing I was going to ask you about, the Power Ranger thing, because that's certainly something that people, particularly on the belt collecting forums, like to bring up from time to time. What's that all about?
Well, I'd always been a massive fan of Power Rangers from when I was young. When they came out, I was literally 5 years old, so I was like their key demographic, so 5-year-old boys. So I sort of got hooked on it, and obviously watched it for many years. Got away from it as I grew up, and when I was in university, I actually played American football, which is obviously the stuff they have over in the States. and I was a lot bigger, and I was playing a defensive end, and I was coming to the end of university, and I realized I'm quite a big guy, and I always sort of used it as an excuse because in football, the bigger you are, the harder you are to move and the harder you can hit. But because I wasn't going to be playing after university, I thought to myself, I really need to start losing some weight. And I got into contact with a friend, and he mentioned about like comic book conventions and that kind of stuff. And I was like, well, I've always been really into Power Rangers, so if I get myself into shape where I can sort of wear spandex and stuff comfortably and go and cosplay in that would be great. So I was doing that. And then I sort of started getting back into the show and watching it and watching the Japanese show, which Power Rangers is taken from, sort of adapted over in America. And then met a good bunch of friends throughout the Power Ranger community and stuff. And now, like, we go up and down all around the UK doing charity events. We've been in Wales. We've been invited to go to Manchester. We've been to London. We've been to Liverpool as guests at different Comic Cons and stuff. And we'd always be there on behalf of the charity. And then sort of anyone who comes over to take a photo with us or asks us about the show or asks us about the props that we have with us would then sort of give a bit of a donation to the charity we're representing. But since getting back into it about, I'd say, maybe 8-9 years ago, I've started getting into collecting again, and they're reproducing all of the toys that all the kids grew up with. So when I was 5 years old, they came out with the Megazords and the Dragonzords and stuff, and now they're re-releasing that with like die-cut 24-karat gold pieces, a bit like wrestling belts, where you can't purchase them under the age of 15. So they're geared towards the adult hardcore collector. So I've pretty much been rolling with that ever since then.
Wow, that's very noble of you. Let's get back to the belts. How do you take care of them? How do you clean them? Have you got a ritual? How often do you do it?
I don't have a ritual, but I know that I don't clean them as often as I really should. I've just moved house here recently, and while packing and unpacking, it's very evident the ones that I clean on a semi-regular basis and the ones that I don't. All I use, though, is warm water and lint-free microfiber cloth, and that generally does the job, and I'll dry them out with that. But I try to clean them at least sort of once a month hereabouts, but that has not happened for quite a while, unfortunately, so I'll be doing a massive clean over the next coming weeks.
Do you ever take your belts out, or are they just purely for display?
Generally, they're for display. Obviously, if I have friends come over, like a few of my Ranger friends were over here just a couple of weeks ago, and obviously they're huge wrestling fans as well, so they want to have a look at them and stuff, so take them out and have a handle of them. Typically, they stay in display cases unless I'm either doing a review on them, doing just a general belt video or a wrestling video where it's nice to have them sort of out on display by my side, or if I'm taking them to a wrestling show.
Now, well, that's the next question I was going to ask you. Have you ever taken a belt to a live show, and what was the result of that?
Yeah. Generally, I'll always take a belt to a show because for a couple of reasons. One, it's just cool to have out and about, and you'll see different fans with different belts and stuff. And also, I've been to maybe 2 wrestling shows since I started my YouTube channel a couple of years ago there where I didn't have a belt with me, and the people recognized me from my channel, and they were one of them was a kid, and one of them was a guy about my age, and both of them seemed so heartbroken that I didn't have one with me. So I thought, okay, maybe I should from now on. But yeah, generally the feedback's pretty good. Whether I've got a replica with me or I've got one of the real belts. The most popular one was when I probably bought the Crumb Rhyme with me because it is very different to the shop replicas that you get. So that was a very popular one.
Have you got a favourite replica belt?
It changes with quality. It used to be the TNA Midwest World title. I really love that design. It's a very well-made belt. But these days, WWE Shop are really knocking them out. So the quality of the WWE Cruiserweight and the NXT belts are really, really good. At the moment, I would probably say the Cruiserweight, but at the moment, they're all pretty much up there. But I'd say at the moment, probably the Cruiserweight.
Okay, time for a bit of a name drop. What are some famous people or some cool people that you've met through the belt collecting hobby?
I don't know famous-wise, but I've met a good few friends. I generally refer to them by their names, not their usernames anymore. So I'm very friendly with Johan or Johan Rules on the forums, Julian, Andy, who's from obviously Belt Addiction, Dan from Leather by Dan or Belts by Dan or Belt Fan Dan, whichever username he's going by. So they're the main ones that I generally talk to. More so probably Johan and Andy more than any else. Obviously, I've got Paul Martin Belts over here in the UK as well, so I talk to him semi-regularly, not as much as I'd like to. But those are the main ones.
What is one belt design that has grown on you over the years?
The one that's probably grown on me is probably the current WWE United States belt, because when it originally debuted in 2003, I absolutely hated it. I thought there was too much paint on it, there's not enough gold showing, and part of it was pure resentment, because as I mentioned earlier, I was a big WCW fan growing up, and for them to replace the WCW US title, which was one of my favourite title designs, with that, I was very, very hesitant to sort of accept it. But over the years, it just seems to have grown on me to the point where I really like that design now. Like, I always hear people saying they need to replace it with something new. It's been there for over 10 years. It's time for a change. But at the same time, to me, that's one of the few belts that's very timeless, because it's got the US flag, and as far as I'm aware, that flag is still the flag of the United States, so that's not gone out of style. It's got the Statue of Liberty, as far as I'm aware. That's still there. It's a very big deal in the United States. So until those things become less important, I don't see the point in changing the title myself.
Is there a design out there that everybody loves, but you secretly hate?
I don't like using the word hate. I think it's too strong of a word, but everyone really loves the classic Intercontinental Championship title design, the one from the 90s and the 80s, and the one that's currently used now in WWE. For me, I don't love that design. I would say that I kind of like it, but to me, it's always been very overhyped by people. Like, to me, it looks more like a world title than mid-card title, and it's just very generic. It's got a globe, it's got a couple of stars thrown on it, kind of thing. It just doesn't really jump out at me when I hear people say how amazing it was or amazing it is. I'm sort of like, it's okay. It's nothing to phone home about. It's not a big gold or a winged eagle or anything, or an undisputed. But yeah, probably that one.
Now, bootlegs. We always come around to it. It's a bit like Shawn Michaels and the Montreal Screwjob. Have you ever owned any bootlegs? What are your opinions on bootlegs? Let's lay it all out on the table.
Always a touchy subject. I have in the past. One of the things with the bootlegs is it's changed now compared to even sort of 3-4 years ago. When it comes down to those, I've always felt like if it's readily available, then there's no reason to purchase it. So, for example, if, say, 10 years ago, I remember when I got my all-gold winged eagle from Reggie Parks, who obviously isn't making belts anymore, or from what I understand, isn't making belts anymore. I ordered a belt from him, and I had it delivered in 4 months. And at the time, you'd still see all these other ones, all these other boots crop up on eBay and stuff like that. The Facebook groups wasn't much of a thing back then. And I'd be thinking, why would you get something that's worse quality than a replica, for more expensive than a replica, and call it a real thing when you can actually purchase the real thing? Now it's a little bit different, because generally the sort of licensing deal with WWE or WWF, or whatever you want to call them, has gone out the window, so those things aren't as readily available. And those who are responsible for producing those kinds of belts and stuff aren't providing the service that they've said they're going to provide. So in my mind, it seems to be that it's become a bit more open season on those kind of things, where if people whose job it is to provide these things aren't providing them, then it's a bit more fair game, in my opinion. I'm not going to openly promote it. I don't own any currently, but I would say that if those people are messing customers around, then why are they being given money by people to provide that service that they're not providing anymore? So I think it's a bit more fair game now. A bit like the J-Mar situation 10 years ago. He went off the grid. He had God knows how many orders to people. So people eventually started mimicking his work, providing sort of big eagles and stuff like that. Whereas now with other belt makers, they're now putting the same kind of stunt. They're popping out a couple of belts here and there, but it's not enough to make up for the 5-year, 6-year wait time.
You mentioned before as well, too, about the quality of replicas improving over time. Do you think if the WWE shop put out some of those classic designs made with the current sort of cast replicas, would that curb a little bit of bootlegs?
I believe it would. The thing there is obviously that the WWE, because of their agreement with the World Wildlife Fund, or whatever they're called, means they can't produce merchandise, as far as I know, with the WWF logo, and I think that would then be the reason. So, for example, they do a cast classic IC now, which is obviously one of the most popular designs in wrestling history, but it's sporting the WWE block logo, and I think so many people want the original WWF one that they'd be willing to go the bootleg route. As far as like classic designs, I mean, there's no reason why WWE can't say go back and redo the Winged Eagle to the point where it was the quality of a Master Series replica, or even the NXT replicas now. But for whatever reason, they're just refusing to do it. And until they sort of almost pull their fingers out, I don't think they're going to really address the situation that they're really making for themselves, because they could make so much money on those belts. They just seem to be leaving on the table. The number one reason a couple of years ago that people seemed to give for owning a bootleg or having one produced or that kind of thing was that they couldn't have it with the right logo, or they couldn't have it period because of the design. It's back then it was more a case of just them not wanting to pay the amount. So when someone would get a boot Winged Eagle, for example, and they would post it online or post it in a group or post it in a forum that did not allow bootlegs, they'd ask why they couldn't, because all they were doing was promoting the product that they'd bought. They explained why, and then they said, yeah, but I can't get that, when actually they could. It just came down to them not being able to afford it, which is understandable because real belts are incredibly expensive. There's no way around that. But then if it's readily available and you can't afford it, then just say that you can't afford it. Don't provide a false reason as to why, kind of thing, because in that, then you're sort of painting yourself into a corner, if you know what I mean. Like, for example, if a belt like the current, now they've had them at WrestleMania weekend, but if I wanted to own a real WWE championship, now I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I can afford one of those. However, up until, say, last weekend, they didn't produce them. So really there's no way of me getting one other than going the bootleg route or having, like I have, buy a replica and customize to the point where it's along the same line in quality. Whereas other people, when a real belt was readily available, they'll sort of phone it in, say they don't want to pay that much money, and then we'll just bootleg to the nth degree. Which, you know what, that's their thing, but it's not something that I'm willing to sort of entertain, if you know what I mean.
And you mentioned before a little bit about the secrecy within the belt collecting community. Where does that stem from? Is it because collectors want to have a bit of kayfabe, they want to be like the wrestlers, or like you mentioned, it's an expensive hobby and not everyone is able to afford real belts? Or is it the availability that not everyone's able to get the belts with the proper logos that they want?
I'm not sure where the secrecy comes from, to be perfectly honest. I think really it starts and really ends with the secrecy on how to make real belts. So I can tell you how many designs of the Undisputed there has been and how many variations of the Big Eagle is till the cows come home. But as far as like the making of a belt, that's the kind of information that I don't have access to and I don't know anything about. But obviously, people who create real belts and sell them as a form of income are very secretive of that, and the fact that if they tell someone else how to make them, then they're going to make them and they're losing money. It would be a bit like someone who is into making wedding cakes and selling them, and they know how to make all the flavors come together, how to get the icing perfect, so there's no wet icing, it's all solid and it's all performed and perfected so that on your wedding day it appears to be absolutely perfect. Those people aren't then going to go and give away their secrets to other people who then can mimic those secrets and then produce the similar quality cakes and then take business away from them. I think that's where it starts. As far as the secrecy of the actual real belt stuff, I think it's become a lot more open in sort of the last sort of 15 years, to the point where a lot of people are trying to educate other people in regards to what defines a real wrestling belt and a replica wrestling belt. Obviously, the replicas are mass-produced, machine-made in China that WWE shops sell. Real belts are acid-etched most of the time, gold and nickel-plated, and then you've got the ring-used quality belts, which obviously are the ones you actually see on TV getting hurled around by these wrestlers. I would have said that wrestling belt collecting has become a lot more open in the last 15 years. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up for debate, but I'd say it's certainly a lot more open than it was when I joined sort of the belt community about 15, 20 years ago.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's good in the sense that people are being more educated in regards to what they're purchasing. So, for example, the WWE released quote-unquote elite replica belts last year, which were basically your standard WWE title and Universal title replica belts with a higher grade stone quality with cubic zirconias in them. And they were charging about $2,000, which is about the price of a real belt when that's not what you were buying. And I don't think many of them sold, mainly because of how open the community is now. Like people like myself who went online and said, listen, you can pay that, that's no problem, but what you're buying, you could get with buying a standard replica for $400, get new stones in there for maybe $250 to $350, and you've saved yourself more than half the price of that belt because what you're buying isn't getting what they're trying to sell. As far as the negative side of it goes, is that everyone tries to come out of the woodworks and proclaim they're a belt maker now when they'll do a few belts, get a bit of business, and then they'll just drop off the face of the earth. There was a belt company called JP Belts a couple of years ago who became the official belt maker for the NWA, and they fizzled out very quickly because they took on more than they could handle because they seemingly only recently learned how to make belts and didn't realize the amount of time and effort it took to make quality belts and how long it took, because obviously if you take on so much work and you don't have the time to dedicate making the belts, then you sort of fall under the weight of your own success. And I think that anyone now who can get a hold of an etcher will make something and then try and flip it on eBay, which is a minefield for belts, quite frankly. I would suggest anyone who's looking to buy a quality belt avoid eBay because there's so many just terrible ones there. And the point is with eBay is that you can throw a photograph of a quality belt on eBay and the one you're selling not be the same as the photo, and eBay don't care. So it's a real tricky business there. But I'd say it has its pros and its cons.
What do you think about the influx of the Facebook groups?
I think it's good in the sense that it's allowing more people to get more in tune with replica belt collectors and real belt collectors. I think it opens up the discussion more in regards to belt designs and stuff, because one of my favorite things to do is just discuss with people about wrestling belts and designs in general, because it's a very niche portion of the demographic. So if you go to a WrestleMania, say there's 100,000 people in the audience, I'd say maybe 50,000 of them have a replica belt, and maybe 300 of them, maybe 800 of them really know their wrestling belts. So it's always good to sort of open up to discussion base. There are sort of Facebook groups that I think are in it potentially for the wrong reason. So there's wrestling belt groups that do raffles every so often. And I think the average fan doesn't realize what they're getting, to the point where they offer up money for a raffle, for example. They win something and think they've got something fantastic, when in reality, it's not what they thought they would get.
What's some of the strangest things that have happened to you as a result of your YouTube channel or of this hobby?
Strangest things. That's a hard one. Having someone come up to me and refer to me as HazardF5 for the first time, that was a really weird experience, because at the time, I think I had like 500 subscribers to my channel and only like a couple of thousand views on it. And I thought, okay, how do you know that? Because I figured no one could actually see them. So that was a very, very weird experience. But pretty much just that in general. So, for example, if I'm going to a show, like I'm going to SmackDown here in London at the O2 in May, and I'll say, oh yeah, I'm heading to SmackDown kind of thing, and someone will either drop me a message or tweet me or post on Instagram saying, hi, I'll be there, I'll be sure to look out for you so we can get a photograph. And I'm thinking, I'm just lit, and this is how it all started. I'm literally a guy with an internet connection, a computer, a belt, and at the time, just a video camera. I say, I'm not one to sort of need to have a photo taken. I'm not a celebrity in any form or fashion, nor do I claim to be by that standard. But if you want to sort of meet up and have a chat and stuff, I'm more than happy to say we're both likely fans of wrestling and wrestling belts in general. But I wouldn't put myself, and I wouldn't encourage anyone else to put me on any kind of pedestal above anyone else who sort of has a belt and a phone.
Now, you mentioned some of the friends that you've made in the hobby before. Who would be some of the biggest jerks in the hobby?
With any fandom, whether it's the Game of Thrones fandom or the wrestling belt fandom or even just the wrestling fandom in general, you're going to have people who you don't generally get along with. I'm not going to name names because anyone who I generally don't get on well with, I just don't associate myself with. Even the people who it's relatively common knowledge. People who either don't like me or I don't get on with, generally I don't talk to, but there will be times when there is a line of communication there where we have either a common interest or a common means of discussion, whether it's a belt design or something happening in the belt world. But I generally don't associate myself with people, or I don't care to take the time to associate myself with people who I know generally aren't a fan of me or don't like me, which is absolutely fine, because we all have people who we don't get on with. Like, you'll go to work and there'll be people at work who you spend time with on a daily basis you don't generally get on with. It's just human nature. But I generally tend not to spend a lot of time either talking to or thinking about those kind of people, because at the end of the day, life's more important. I've got bigger things to worry about, as I'm sure they do.
What do you hate most about this hobby?
Can I say the prices? If I was going to say anything, I would say it's a hard one. I'd almost say the laziness of some people when it comes to creating a product. WWE have been very guilty of it for a very, very long time. The fact that they can produce replica belts that are the same standard of a real belt or similar to, and it'd be a very reasonable price, but they choose not to, because for them it's a lot cheaper to produce the lesser quality replicas. So they were capable of doing the cast replicas for a very long time. They did it with the Andre Big Gold, they did it with the White Classic IC, and they just choose not to because it's easier for them to do a lower quality replica. They seem to have realized that was an error now, but things like the Fondue Big Gold belt, which I've always said was a fantastic opportunity to have a 3D created real belt quality, but they've sort of just phoned it in with the dimensions and the arch and the belt and just little things that you could have tweaked if you had a little bit more effort into it, to the point where it could go from a good belt, and don't get me wrong, the Fondue belt is a great quality belt and it's a good replica, but for the same price you could have had something even better than that. But they decided not to bother, because at the end of the day they'd already had so many orders, so if it's not broke, why fix it, kind of thing.
Well, that's enough of the negatives. What about some positives? What do you like the most about this hobby?
Probably the discussion side of things. I mean, I'm all for having a conversation with anyone about wrestling belts and styles and wrestling in general. So I'll sort of throw something out there, because I've always been very open to the fact that the Eagle and the Classic IC are some of the most overrated belts in wrestling history based on their design, because they're thought very fondly of because of the time that they were used in. So it's not necessarily the design that's fantastic, but it's the period of time they were used on TV that people think of fondly. So they think of the Hulk Hogan era, they think of just the pre-Attitude era, that kind of thing. So I'm happy to sort of like sit down and sort of have a discussion online with people as to why I don't like those belts as much, and why I do think that the Undisputed title belt is the greatest WWF/E championship belt design of all time, and sort of get their thoughts and opinions and do a bit of back and forth, because everyone has an opinion and everyone is welcome to it, and everyone generally, as far as belts are concerned, can back them up with discussion. And like, as long as the discussion is sort of fruitful and polite and stuff, and it's just not a bunch of name calling, I'm all for it.
Have you ever owned or have you ever held any ring-used belts before?
I haven't owned any ring-used belts as such. There was a period of time there a couple of years ago where a friend of mine did. I managed to get my hands on a strap that was used by WWE back in, I want to say, the early 2011, 2010-ish era, of a 3D Big Gold. And it blows your mind when you hold these things in person, and you just think to yourself, how can they carry these things around with them all the time? Because they're so heavy compared to the replica belts. Obviously, I've held a number of real belts since then, but the weight of the J-Mar style 3D Big Gold itself is absolutely astronomical, considering it's not your biggest belt, but it would certainly weigh the most compared to most real belts I've held.
What do you think about the current designs that are being used by the WWE, TNA, and the UFC?
Well, I loathe the new UFC belts with all my heart, because I think it's a crime against belt collecting for what they've done to it. I think they had a belt design that was very classical with the UFC logo, with the octagon in the background and the floral pattern. I think they should have just stuck with that. I see where they're going with the new legacy belt, with the whole 25-year anniversary thing. I think they've just tried too much too fast with it. The TNA belts I really like. They're a bit different, nickel-plated and stuff, so I like the fact they're trying to be different. Not all of them have hit. I'm not a fan of the tag belts, but the X Division title and the world title they've got there at the moment are absolutely wonderful. The WWE, I always get into discussions with people about it because a lot of their belts now are very, very similar. So you've got the NXT and the women's NXT belts that are very similar, just the color changes. You've got the Universal and the World titles that are very similar to the women's titles. And while they're not the most aesthetically pleasing as far as like a traditional wrestling belt is concerned, I would love to have the Undisputed title back tomorrow or the Big Eagle back tomorrow. But from a company standpoint, they're going for a branding here. So it makes sense to have a big logo on your championship so everyone will know that's not an Ultimate Fighting belt, that's not a TNA belt, that's a WWE championship. It's got your logo front and center. So from a branding standpoint, I 100% understand where WWE is going. I'm not a huge fan of that, but I understand why they've done it.
Reggie Parks, Dave Milliken, J-Mar, Wildcat, or another. What's your favourite designer and maker?
That one's a hard one because not all of them design their own stuff. I would probably say my two favourite belt designs of all time have always been the original Big Gold Belt and the Undisputed Championship. So I would say, as far as the makers go, I would probably lean quality-wise to sort of Reggie Parks, Dave Milliken, because their etching and their paintwork has always been spot on, and at least for a time was always seemingly, I've never held a reused J-Mar, so I wouldn't be able to tell you, always seemed a lot better than J-Mar's. However, the designs that he used, as far as I'm aware, he had input, or it was provided to him by WWE. So, for example, as far as I understand, the Big Eagle belt was designed by WWE and J-Mar just produced it. That's my understanding. I might be wrong on that, but I've not spoken to Joe Marshall, J-Mar, I don't know. But I'd say, as far as designs go, around the age of the Attitude Era to the sort of 2005 Ruthless Aggression Era, J-Mar style were my favourite designs because I was always a big fan of the Oval IC, and the Undisputed was always my favourite title design. I was always a big fan of the Big Gold as well, and the European Championship, which always generally were J-Mar made belts. Whether he designed them, I'm not sure, but they were certainly my favourite designs.
And if money was no object, what would be the one belt that you could own happily and not own any other belt?
I always get this question, and I would always say whoever owns the original Crumrine Big Gold belt, and I do know who it is, but that person is a very, very lucky person, because if there was one belt I was going to have, it would absolutely be that one. But based on my understanding, they never plan on selling that for the rest of their life. So if I was going to pick another one, I would probably offer as much money as I could to the WWE, because I know they've got it still, and go for that Brock Lesnar version 4 belt, Undisputed style, with the 5 plates without the logo plate. That would be my go-to, because back then, Brock was easily my favourite wrestler.
Now, how can people get in contact with you? You mentioned your YouTube channel, you mentioned your Twitter channel. What's the best way that people who are listening to this interview can look you up on the internet?
My YouTube's always readily available. I don't have any comments or anything turned off like that. So if they want to check out my stuff, YouTube's probably the best bet. As far as talking to me directly, probably dropping me a message on Twitter at HazardF5, or even more so Instagram at HazardF5, because generally I check up on my Instagram more so than my Twitter nowadays.
HazardF5, thank you very much for joining me on the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
No problem at all. My pleasure.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovyGshop.com.
So there he is, folks, the YouTube guy himself, HazardF5. Now let's take a sneak peek at what's coming your way on the next Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
Let's take a step back from real belts. On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast, we'll be taking a closer look at a replica NXT World Title Belt. In the meantime, make sure you don't miss a thing by subscribing to this YouTube channel, and you can join in the conversation on Twitter at Groovy G Belt Show or on Facebook. Until then, take care. It's bye for now.